tools of Stone Age man. Okay, now you understand the bias that's built in here with this. The tools of early Stone Age man, the kind of basically these shards of rock that had been used and cut out to be used as early tools. Well, that theory that has been around for years took a little bit of a blow when it was discovered in Australia that these exact shards, same exact look, I mean in the record it looks exactly the same, came about as a result of monkeys grabbing rocks and hitting their food with it. Now, I thought, what timing? Okay, so they've had to backtrack on that theory. Okay, they think they've got it all figured out, and then something comes out, and God says, check the monkeys out, guys. Okay, so we just, that illustrated that point, I think, pretty well. There was also something where some people were fooled quite quickly on something in archaeology in Israel, same week. Okay, so my point was of how we can elevate so quickly human scholarship and wisdom, and to do so at the expense of what God says. That will never go well for you, my friend. Because there's going to be retraction and retraction on the human side as evidence points and says God was right all along. Now, just want to illustrate that. Now we're going to move in and pick up with that idea now, but back in its context in first century Corinth, beginning in verse 22, where Paul writes, "For Jews request a sign, and Greeks seek after wisdom. But we preach Christ crucified, to the Jews a stumbling block, and to the Greeks foolishness." Now I'm going to stop right there. It captures the kind of a contrast that he is making on two parts. One, the Jews and the Greeks, they have different objections and problems to the gospel, and then also at the nature of the way in which they react to it, and then what Paul preached. Okay? And the words themselves that are found here are really important, because what they're seeking, okay, that actually is very important. When he starts off and says, after that, he's building this case, says, and Jews are seeking a sign. Okay, now, let's try to figure this out to get it in its historical context. What sign were Jews seeking? They weren't Christians, so what would they have been seeking? Okay, they were still looking for a Messiah, weren't they? They were looking for a coming Messiah, and the point was this had been done to Christ multiple times, if you'll recall, and they were always, it was nothing would satisfy them. It's quite interesting to have Jesus feed 5,000 and then be asked to perform a sign. We want more. Or he's thrown, demons out, and, well, you need to do something to show us that you're the Messiah. Okay. That attitude is really what's here, is that they're always seeking something that satisfies what they have in mind. That was the problem why they rejected Jesus, and it's the reason why they're rejecting the gospel. Those are connected. There's a reason why. Okay. Now we're going to get to the Greeks in a moment, but I want to connect these and show why this is a problem in principle.
Even though they heard God speak, they were ready to tell them.
I think that's a good point. I mean, the times in which God spoke, though, like you say at Christ's baptism, I think you're thinking like in John 12, we don't know for sure what they would have heard, but the thing was there was evidence. There was evidence, and they didn't want to see the evidence. They had all sorts of evidence in Jesus himself, but they didn't care. Because if your heart is already set on what you're going to do, evidence is actually irrelevant. Evidence at that point becomes something you do to fill in the blanks of what you want to believe. That's the problem. Okay? Now, let's look at it from the side of the Greeks. They're asked, so you have the Jews are asking for a sign, the Greeks are seeking wisdom. Now, what were the Greeks, when it says the Greeks, okay, now this is in Corinth, so that is very close to the heart of ancient Greek culture. When they were seeking wisdom, what were they looking for? No classicists here, huh? Not really surprised, there aren't very many alive. They would have been looking for, this is the relationship to all the philosophy. Okay? Now, in particular, if you remember in Acts chapter 17, Paul found that the major two philosophies current in this day were Epicureanism and Stoicism. Now, both of those go back actually in ways, have Platonic roots. So a lot of this is Platonic wisdom for Plato. Okay. Y'all enjoying the history lesson, everybody? Okay, so you go through here and you get this idea, but the point is they were trying to figure all these things out on their own. I mean, you have books on ethics. I mentioned last week Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. Pretty good considering what he had to work with. Pretty wrong because it's not inspired. Okay? Why? Because you're trying to come up with answers for the human condition and what to do and how to live without considering the creator of life in the equation. So the whole idea today, whenever you look at various ethical systems that are attempting to find a way to explain right and wrong, and do that within an atheist framework, they end up caught in a loop. It's a very simple loop of right and wrong. Because if you want to go, if you've ever heard of the name Jeremy Bentham, perhaps, you go into utilitarianism, you can have the idea of you do the loving thing to do, right? Always do the loving thing, Lee. How do you know what the loving thing to do is? You don't have a clue. Not if you're an atheist. On what are you going to base that? Okay, there are certain, the good is the good for the most people. Well, how do you know what that is before you do it? Was it morally right or morally wrong to drop the atomic bomb? You don't know. Because you don't know if it was going to do more good in the end or more bad in the end. And I would argue that if you wanted to, you could argue you still don't know. Okay? That's where you're left in terms of right and wrong without God. You end up then just seeking some kind of general balance, which is what Aristotle did. Just want to point out their problem for them. Now notice what I want to get to, why I think this is so important. What they were asking for something, the Greeks were seeking something. We need to appreciate when we bring an agenda of expectation of what we want to get out of something to what God says, it's going to influence whether we accept what God actually said. When you decide beforehand that I want to believe this, or this is unacceptable to me, either one of those, it's already prejudiced you about what you're about to hear. That was their problem. The Jews they wanted a sign. If you didn't fulfill their expectation of a sign, they didn't want to talk to you. The Greeks, they were busy seeking wisdom, and it was in philosophy, and there's certain methods that you go through. That's not how Paul was approaching it, which is what the next verse is talking about. And that's why they had so many that they weren't interested, not even to listen. So now you look at verse 23 and see how he approached that. Okay, that's what the problem was. But we preach Christ crucified. It doesn't matter what they are asking for, what they are seeking. We're preaching what God tells us to preach. We're going to give them what they need, even if it's not what they want. Because what they want can't help them. A sign to fulfill some Jewish sense wouldn't have gone anywhere because it would only obligate you to keep doing whatever they wanted. Same thing would have been true with the Greeks. What they needed was Jesus. Okay? And it's not a coincidence that he emphasizes crucified. We preach, okay, proclaim. Okay, that's a strong idea. Get the message out there. We proclaim Christ having been crucified. Now, what is Christ? Okay, Christos, which is the Greek form of Messiah. It means anointed one. So for the Jews hearing that, we preach Christ having been crucified. That tells you what part of the problem was. Okay, so that's talking about where the issue is. So when he comes to that and says that what they probably respected that and they responded to it, the Jews found that to be a stumbling block. The idea of a crucified Messiah was completely foreign to their expectations. Why? Say that again, Paco. Good. They were looking for a political leader. They were looking for political salvation. And they needed spiritual salvation. Glad that's not a problem today. He says, tongue firmly in cheek. Jesus. Yeah. Yeah. He didn't fulfill their expectation, what they wanted, so they're not interested. Why? Second point, they didn't think they needed that kind of Messiah. So many times what you end up with as a problem is that when people think either that there's no hell, sometimes there's no heaven, okay, so therefore what happens in life is irrelevant, or they think that they're already saved, or that everybody goes to heaven. You take any one of those three ideas and you put it out there, and that's what people believe, then you end up with, why bother? That's an important hurdle you've got to get over if you're going to teach people, is to understand their own need. The Jews and the Gentiles rejected the gospel because they didn't think they needed the gospel. They rejected a crucified Messiah because they didn't think they needed a crucified Messiah. And sometimes we get ourselves into trouble because we don't appreciate some of these same things. Because remember though, for the Jews, the idea of the Messiah dying on a tree, that was a curse, right? Deuteronomy? That was an abhorrent idea. That the Messiah, no, y'all don't understand. That's a ridiculous idea. He's a king. He's exalted. Everybody loves him. Not a curse. So they rejected out of hand. Okay? That was a scandal to the Jewish mind. The word stumbling block, scandalon, that's where we get our word scandal from. It's such a big deal, you're not getting past it. The Greeks, on the other hand, were dismissive of the idea of resurrection. Why would you follow someone who's already dead? Well, yeah, but those are the ideas, and that would pass on. They didn't follow him. Christianity is calling you to follow Christ as your king. Well, he was crucified. You know, that was judgment against him in every way. What I want to get across to you that you've got to try to get in your mind is that when you obeyed the gospel, if you have, you did so in an environment in which these things were acceptable and even understood to be true by most of the people around you. The Corinthians obeyed in a completely hostile environment intellectually. They had done so much more in terms of how far they had to go. We're very critical of when we get over to chapter 6, we look at that list of sins, we're critical of their division, we're critical of how could they let this go on, what kind of questions are these? Look at where they started. And have some humility. So when they come back and they think of this as foolishness. You're going to follow someone who's dead? I mean, the Greeks probably would have thought some of the other stuff with, even though they had it in their own background, the idea of hero cult, it was different than resurrection. The Romans, with their idea of apotheosis, which was to, after particularly one of the Caesars died, was to deify him and treat him as a god, is the technical term. This is, they know he's dead, and they know he's not Caesar now. This is very different. I always like to point out one of the big differences so you appreciate it more. A Caesar was a man who ruled with an iron fist, died, and then perhaps people treated as a god. Jesus was God, who then lived as man and died and rose to rule. Those are two very different models. Okay? That's what we have to appreciate, that what they were getting here. Okay, so now, verse 24, for our benefit. But to those who are called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ, the power of God and the wisdom of God. Okay, those two things are related to what he had just said, but let's first deal with the called. Remember how many times we've already seen that language in this chapter? The called. We go all the way back up, talked about called to be saints. Paul had talked about being called to be an apostle, and then we saw it later on being called down here in verse 9. This is a regular idea. What is the point? The point actually is not that just that you'd heard, but to be the called was the people who responded appropriately to the message. He's now creating a contrast. Okay, comparisons and contrast are really important in Bible study. He's now saying you've got these Jews and Greeks who treated this as nonsense and wanted something else, but to the called, they treated it as a legitimate message and accepted the message. He's already laid that down beforehand, so we know who he's talking about. He's talking about Christians. Notice, Jews and Greeks. Gospel's for all. What is it then? He's already implied then that they had to overcome those prejudices to accept the gospel. How do you do that? To those who are called. Okay. And this is an adjective. So those who are the called. Both Jews and Greeks, Christ, again, that's Messiah. That's important for the benefit of understanding how it works in here. Christ is God's power and God's wisdom. That is, he is a manifestation of that. And that he is the response to those kind of problems that they had. What have we seen regularly? When you see power, what is it often connected to? Well, if it were, okay, now I'm going to have to specify. That's because that is a correct answer, depending upon the translation. This is a word that is dunamis, and it has to, I call it kinetic power. Okay, authority is rooted in a word, exousia, which is more potential. Okay, the root power. Power in motion. And that, now put it in the context of what they were looking at. They were looking at for a sign, the Jews were. And what were the Greeks seeking after? Wisdom. What is Jesus? He is God's power. The sign was miraculous, y'all. Connecting dots for you. Christ is God's power and God's wisdom. That is, the proof came both in what he did and what he said, that he was from God. What do you find with Jesus? For those, now remember, he's talking to people who had not seen Jesus in the flesh. But that did not matter. When Jesus was in the flesh, this is what he was, and this is how he functions, and therefore how he is presented in the gospel. He is the one who was crucified, but as he lived and what he did, he is a manifestation of God's power, because his whole ministry was pointing to God did this. God showed that this is from him. That Jesus is who he says he is. He is the Messiah. Why? Because he's doing miracles. He's doing things. Remember, what do people say? We've never seen anything like this. Who could be the Messiah? If not this one, who could be? Because they understood from Isaiah that that's what the Messiah would do. He was showing the power. The Jews are looking for signs. Jesus demonstrated power. The Greeks are looking for wisdom. Go back and look at what Jesus taught. They were looking, in a sense, what he is saying is, the reality is they rejected Jesus because of the crucifixion. That's why he emphasized that. Because of the crucifixion, and they failed to recognize he fulfilled everything that they said they were trying to find. You want wisdom? Look here. Here's where you're going to find wisdom. They were talking about a wisdom that was based upon their own thoughts and arguments instead of, here's what God has revealed, Tracy. No one ever spoke like that. This man is different. And the whole point was, and this goes back to the episode that Lynn was talking about God's own testimony. That is, I tend to think of three places, and that is one at the baptism, one there in John 12, where the voice is above, and then one at the transfiguration. This is God's testimony, and then that was amplified. The Holy Spirit, remember, after Jesus' baptism, he makes miraculous available to Jesus, even his humanity, and he is able to do miracles. That's when he begins those things. Take away the limits of the flesh in that. And he is doing that all with a purpose. The purpose was not simply to randomly do magic tricks for people. That had nothing to do with this. Every single thing Jesus did had a very specific purpose to it. To demonstrate the character of God, compassion, love, his identity, his purpose, and the greatness of God, and to point people to his identity as the Messiah. Every single thing he did. Okay, that was fulfilled and completed, shown to be true. And then he's teaching them, and no one ever taught like this man. Wisdom. Again, what had happened? They came in with their own expectation of what they needed or what they wanted, and then they ran, I call it running God's word through your own personal strainer. I talk about this to the guys in school all the time. You leave your strainer at home and let God strain you. You need to run your ideas through God's strainer. Okay.
Is that you wind up worshiping a God that's not even a God in the Bible?
Well, sure. Sure. I mean, as Sri was pointing out, you end up with worshiping a God not of the God of the Bible. That's true, I would say, to some extent, about anything if it's fully carried out to its complete extent. And that is, any kind of thing that is wrong has theological implications. Okay? That is, it speaks in some way to God's character. A wrong doctrine is going to imply something wrong about God's character. Okay? Now, we need to make a distinction here, because not everyone fully carries out all the all the things to their fullest extent, and therefore you have to recognize they don't understand that connection. But yeah, it can cause problems. And you end up, this is one of the reasons why you end up, if you go in your expectation today, okay, let me throw that out there. What do people expect, practically speaking today, when they come to the Bible and to God, the idea of God? What are their expectations, typically? Do they have an understanding of what they think God should be? Okay, their servant, yes. Santa Claus. They want what? They want to be happy? Okay. Which usually comes back to this about give me what I want and I'll be happy because I think I know what is best for me, which is the problem. That's the problem. We think we know what's best for us. Don't people, this is why you get the idea of they're looking for the God of love. Right? They don't want a God of light. They don't want a holy God necessarily, do they? You see, when we decide beforehand what God we are wanting, that's why you end up with these kind of false ideas about a God of the Old Testament, the God of the New Testament. It's just, that's a different God. That just means you're interpreting both wrong. Okay? Sure. Okay. Okay, yes, they don't want to have their faults exposed. Okay? That's one of the reasons, yes. Okay, Hannah? A God of tough love. Don't want a God of tough love? Okay, yes. Okay. You see, though, that this problem is still in existence in its own way? Okay. Now, there are two things I want you to take from that. First, make sure that you're dealing with yourself on how you see God. And make sure you are working to maintain a biblical view of God, not a comfortable view of God, a view of God that makes you feel comfortable, but a biblical view of God. You get yourself right with God in every way, and that will produce comfort. Yes, that's a different thing, though, as an aim. 2, make sure you appreciate this challenge when you're going out to talk to people. That because of their underlying views of what their expectations are, most of the time, if you don't get through some of those expectations and false set of assumptions, you can throw scripture at them all day long, it's not going to matter. Because they've got a barrier up to those things, and you got to get the barrier down. Okay? So we've got to make sure that we're not just out there, that we have the end in mind of making sure and reaching people's souls to save them. And that means they're going to have to accept, and listen to me here, they're going to have to realize how vulnerable they are, and what sin has done to them. People do not like to feel vulnerable. That's part of the point. Okay? You know what else? You don't like to feel vulnerable. We'll do all sorts of things to try to create barriers to our own vulnerability instead of actually addressing it. Okay? And the way to address it is to recognize, if you're a human being, you're vulnerable in just about every way. You're susceptible to sin, and you will experience death unless Jesus comes first. Okay? So both spiritually and physically, you are a corruptible person by nature, that you are potentially corruptible. And your life is, like right now, physically we don't mind admitting it, right? We'll advertise this, right? Okay. I'm finally to the age, or almost, I think, some of you may argue with me, where I get to start admitting these things and get in the club. You know what I'm talking about? You know what I'm talking about? That's where I get together with people, we talk about how much we hurt. Come on, people. Anybody with me? All right. Went to my orthopedist. I've had 6 knee surgeries on my left knee, if y'all don't know. I got that official word just 2 weeks ago. bone on bone. Yay! There's a reason why I hurt. Okay. We don't mind accepting, well, we kind of do a little bit, but we have to accept that the body's breaking down. This isn't working like it used to. Can someone please put an elevator for the school, please? Okay. No. You know what we don't want to do? We don't like doing? We don't like admitting that where we're broken down spiritually. We don't like admitting things we don't know. We don't like admitting our sin. We don't like admitting that I want to believe this because. We don't like to fall into that category as I don't want to do this because I have friends and family guilty of this. We don't want to do that because it exposes us. It exposes us. Saria. Mm-hmm. Yes. It does, I think you're right. It does help other people. Okay, now I'm going to go out on a limb. I think it's easier depending upon how you started. I would argue on this point it's harder if you were raised in the church. Because that means that you're taught with more knowledge growing up, you had some of these things, and when you repented, the challenges of things you had to leave behind were not nearly the same as someone who has lived life as an adult before they even came to the gospel. That's very different starting points. You ought to be thankful because you had a good foundation that people they've had to catch up on. But also, the gospel will humble you up front in a hurry. And we need to make sure when we teach it, no matter at what age, that you need to be an age old enough, and there is not a specific age, but you need to be at an age where you can feel being humbled by it. Okay, so I think that's a legitimate point. Okay, verse 25. Because, now we got explanation to put all this together. Because the foolishness of God is wiser than men, and the weakness of God is stronger than men. He's still got these two concepts that he's been using and paralleling throughout this section. Okay? So he's switched it around now. He'd had wisdom. Now he's flipped it around to talk about the foolishness of God. Now, why would you say something like foolishness and weakness are not things that you would typically call God's attributes, are they? I serve a foolish God. I serve a weak God. Okay, no. He's using those rhetorically by comparison with these Jews and Greeks. And that is let's start. What's the dumbest thing God ever did? Now, that's a trick question if anybody wants to know. That is a trick question. Don't fall for it. It says, well, God never does dumb things. Yeah. Whatever you want to put there as being the smallest little thing, you think, well, why did he make a mosquito? It says, to teach you how a hose needs to work. To teach you about, you know what, I thought if you put a needle under your arm, you could pull something out of there, it could be valuable. Whatever you want to put as whatever's the smallest thing, there is more wisdom in that act than in every library, at all the libraries that have ever existed, and all the geniuses that have ever existed around here. So he's asking about biases. You are going to be a product of everything you've ever been taught, right or wrong. Okay? You're going to be you're going to be influenced by all the people with whom you've had contact. Okay? Now, that is why you have to learn how to filter properly and to use God's word properly as a filter. Okay? So that you are always growing, learning. Now, the flip side of this is you recognize bias, and I want to get this in before the bell rings, is sometimes what's happened, and you see a lot of this actually today, is we decide we recognize that there was a bias or something that was taught that, okay, well, I don't really see that. Sometimes we don't see that because we don't know enough yet. Okay? But sometimes we just, no, there's a problem here with that. And then at that point, we decide it was the problem with the Bible rather than how we were taught. Okay? And instead of becoming our own really good student, we have a rejection of all former association of the teachers, and then we latch on to the next group that's willing to teach me as I go. See this all the time. See this in preachers. They go from whoever taught them to the next person that teaches them, and they just kind of go around doctrinally. Whoever's the strongest voice in their head at the time. What does that say? It goes back to verse 13. We've got a following men problem. And biases are very important to be able to pull that out to make sure that we get a following God answer and following Christ. So that when he says that foolishness is wiser than men, there's not a thing God has ever done that is foolish. But his foolishness, when we stack up what we think are these great discoveries, great things that we've got all figured out, how far away do you think it takes to get to the foolishness of God? Don't bother trying to make that trip. The same thing is true, and the weakness of God is stronger than men. God isn't weak. You know what's, the bell's about to ring, but think about how much of this world and its thinking is about power seeking of one way or another through money or political influence. That's when you need to go back to Psalm 2, and you got the people and the kings and the leaders, and they think they've got it all down and what they're going to do to the Messiah, and God shall hold them in derision. Why? Because God accomplished exactly what he planned on. And if we think we're going to be able to do better than that or stop that, we have a lot higher opinion of ourselves than we should. We will pick up next week, I think, with verse 26. Thank you for your participation.